Welcome back this evening. It's time again to let the world grow quiet. All the noise, all the movement, it can wait until morning. For now, there's only stillness, the kind that feels like dusk settling softly across the edge of thought. Take a deep breath in and let it go. Feel the weight of the day drift a little farther away with each exhale. The light fades slower now, stretching itself thin before disappearing. You've arrived at that quiet in-between where evening and night begin to blur. Tonight's story is called The Valley Where Shadows Rested. It's about a place where the sunlight lingers long enough for every shadow to grow soft, where they stretch themselves across the hills to sleep when the world grows tired. Some say that if you stay long enough, your own shadow learns how to rest too. So settle in. Let the stillness find you. There's nowhere else to be tonight. Only the slow descent into quiet and the story waiting to unfold. The road into the valley was little more than a path drawn in faint curves through tall, dry grass. The light that evening was strange, stretched thin, quiet, as if it had been holding its breath all day. Every step I took stirred the dust in soft spirals, tiny ghosts rising and settling again before they could be carried away. There wasn't much sound beyond that, just the slow rhythm of my steps and the occasional sigh of wind curling down from the hills. The valley revealed itself gradually. One moment, I was surrounded by trees. The next, they opened up to a wide basin that seemed to hold the last of the sunlight. It poured down the slopes like liquid amber, pooling low and deep until the entire hollow glowed as if lit from within. The air shimmered faintly, not from heat, but from the slow, invisible movement of the day exhaling. The shadows here behaved differently. They didn't fall sharply the way they usually do. They folded themselves across the earth, soft and heavy, stretching farther than seemed possible. It was as if the valley itself asked them to stay, offering rest after a long day of following everything that moved. I could feel it in the air, that quiet invitation to pause. I found a place to sit along a low stone wall, half buried in the soil. The surface was warm still, holding onto the memory of the sun. I set down my bag and leaned back, watching as the light faded, little by little, from gold to blue to something that didn't quite have a name. The shadows around me deepened, but not in darkness, in texture, in calm. For a moment, it seemed like the valley was breathing. The grass bent in small collective movements, the same way it might if the earth beneath it had just shifted in its sleep. And then, slowly, I noticed something else. The faint outline of my own shadow beside me, lying still, as if it too had grown tired of moving. It didn't mimic my posture anymore. It simply rested. I stayed until the first stars appeared, small and uncertain. By then the air had cooled, and the valley had fallen completely silent. There was no rustle of insects, no call of birds, no hum of distant wind, just that quiet, suspended peace, as though sound itself had chosen to sleep. When I woke the next morning, the sun was already high, but the air was cool and still. The valley looked different in daylight, wide and gentle, its slopes covered in soft grasses that shimmered silver green when the breeze passed over them. The shadows had retreated, folded neatly into the creases of the land, as if they'd spent the night sleeping and were only now beginning to stir. I stretched my arms, half expecting mine to rise with me, but it stayed slow to move, heavy, as if it hadn't quite woken up yet. The light felt thinner here, like water spread across a surface that never quite dries. I could see the faint shimmer of heat along the horizon, even though it wasn't warm enough for it. It was the kind of morning that made time feel longer, the kind where moments didn't pass so much as unfold. I started walking, following a line of flat stones that led down into the lowest part of the valley. Each step left only the faintest impression in the dirt before the grass leaned back in place. Even my footprints seemed reluctant to disturb the calm. A few birds circled far above, their calls muffled and soft, fading before they could echo. It was as though sound itself was resting here too. At the center of the valley, there was a shallow pool, barely more than a wide depression filled with clear water. It reflected the sky so perfectly that, for a moment, I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. The surface rippled lightly as the wind brushed over it, bending the reflection of the clouds into soft, dreamlike shapes. When I knelt to touch it, the water was cool, and my shadow followed the motion like a slow echo. It wasn't until then that I noticed something strange. The shadow in the water didn't match my movement exactly. It lagged behind by just a heartbeat, almost hesitant, as though it wanted to stay where it was. I smiled and moved my hand again, and again the reflection followed, late and unwilling. The valley was teaching me something, though I didn't yet know what. When I looked around, I realized every tree, every blade of grass cast a shadow that felt peaceful. They weren't reaching or stretching or clinging to the light. They were simply resting, present but unhurried, content to just be. And I thought, maybe that's all this place was meant for, a space where even the unseen could stop moving for a while. The hours slipped by in a kind of slow harmony. I wandered without direction, tracing faint paths between the hills where light and shade mingled like threads in a single weave. Sometimes the wind came through carrying warmth. Other times, it cooled as if remembering the night before. Everything moved gently, nothing rushing to become what it wasn't yet. At one bend in the path, I came across an old wooden post standing alone in the grass. Whatever sign it once held was long gone, but a cluster of wildflowers had grown up around its base, the petals the color of fading twilight. Their shadows curved away from them in soft arcs, long and delicate, like brush strokes painted by the sun itself. I bent to look closer, and for a heartbeat they seemed to shift, not away from the light, but toward it. The movement was small, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. Each shadow folded gently forward, pressing into the earth as though trying to sink deeper into rest. It felt intentional, like a sigh from the ground. I found myself whispering to them, not words, just quiet sounds, the kind you make when you don't want to disturb the stillness. Further along, I found a small clearing framed by two bent trees. Their branches reached toward one another but didn't touch, leaving a thin line of sky visible between them. The light that passed through that gap was soft and golden, the kind that seemed to weigh nothing at all. I sat beneath it and closed my eyes. The valley felt alive then, though not in any way I could explain. It was as if the place had been waiting for someone, not to change it, not to name it, just to notice. The air moved with a rhythm that matched my breath, and the earth beneath my palms felt faintly warm, humming with a pulse older than the hills themselves. I stayed like that until I couldn't tell where my shadow ended and the valley began. When I opened my eyes again, the light had changed. The sun was sinking lower, painting the slopes in amber and rose. The shadows, once faint, began to lengthen again, slowly, dreamily, returning to the softness I'd seen when I first arrived. They looked content, even grateful, to stretch and rest again. And as I stood to leave the clearing, I noticed mine beside me, lingering just a little behind, as though reluctant to wake. I smiled, nodded to it quietly, and kept walking toward the deeper light of evening. The sun dipped lower, brushing the edge of the hills until the entire valley turned to amber. Everything around me seemed to glow from within, the stones, the grass, even the air itself, alive with faint shimmer. It was that quiet hour when the world forgets what time it is, when everything lingers for just a moment too long before letting go. The wind had gone still, and the sound of my footsteps felt too loud for such a place. I followed a faint trail that curved toward a cluster of low rocks. From there, I could see the whole valley, a slow bowl of light and shadow shifting like breathing cloth. The shadows now lay so long they met each other in the center, overlapping softly until the ground looked like rippling water. I watched as mine joined them, sliding away from me with unhurried grace. A faint sound reached me then, not wind, not water, but something between them. A soft murmur that rose and fell in rhythm, as though the valley itself was speaking. I held my breath, listening. It wasn't language exactly, more like tone, a low, harmonic hum that felt less heard than remembered. It carried peace, not mystery. The sound grew clearer as the light faded. It rolled along the hills like a sigh, then quieted again, leaving the air trembling in its wake. The ground seemed to pulse faintly with it, a heartbeat so slow it might have belonged to the earth itself. And in that rhythm, I could almost sense 1,000 resting shadows breathing together. I sat down on the rocks and let the sound pass through me. The last light of the sun stretched across my hands, turning them the color of honey. My own shadow, thin and quiet, pressed flat against the stones as if it had finally found a place to sleep. I didn't move. The peace was too deep, too complete to disturb. When the light finally dimmed to gray, the murmur faded too, leaving only the faint chirp of crickets waking for the night. The valley had changed again, not darker, not colder, just different. It had become something you didn't look at but felt, something you carried away with you, even after you left. By the time night arrived, the valley glowed faintly under a pale wash of starlight. The air had grown cool, and a thin mist began to gather in the lower fields, drifting like breath from the sleeping earth. I followed the narrow trail down toward the center, where the last light of day still lingered in the shallows of the pool. It looked almost alive, the surface trembling in tiny ripples that caught and released the faint glow of the stars. I sat by the edge and let my fingers trail through the water. It was warmer than I expected, smooth as silk, carrying reflections that seemed to move on their own. My hand stirred the surface, and for a moment I saw my shadow again, stretching beneath the ripples, soft and slow as drifting ink. It looked peaceful there, floating weightless in the light. The crickets had quieted, and the wind had gone completely still. Even the stars seemed to hold their breath. The silence was so deep, it almost felt like sound itself had gone to sleep. I breathed carefully, not wanting to wake it. Then, just as the water settled, I felt a faint vibration beneath my hand, the same low hum I'd heard earlier. It rose gently from the ground and passed through me, slow and rhythmic, like a lullaby sung by the valley itself. The ripples widened, gliding toward the edges until every shadow touching the pool shimmered faintly. It was as if the whole valley had drawn one long breath together. I looked up to the slopes and saw movement, faint shapes sliding softly along the hillsides. The shadows were drifting, leaving the ground like mist lifting from water. They didn't rise far, just enough to float in the air, folding over one another before slowly sinking back into the grass. The sight filled me with a kind of quiet awe that felt older than words. When it ended, the night seemed lighter somehow, as though it had exhaled the weight it carried. The hum faded. The pool went still, and the valley returned to silence, deep, patient, eternal. I stayed there long after until the stars blurred and my eyes grew heavy. I don't remember falling asleep, only waking to the first silver hint of dawn. The mist had thinned, resting low over the field like a soft blanket. The world felt hushed, waiting for the first sound to break the night's hold. Even the birds had yet to stir. When I stood, the air carried the faintest chill. I looked around the valley. Everything was washed in pale blue, the kind of light that comes before morning truly decides to arrive. The shadows that had once drifted freely now lay still again, content in their places, as if they had settled into the earth to rest for another day. It felt like I'd witnessed something meant to remain unseen. I climbed the ridge slowly, my steps quiet on the damp grass. Each footfall seemed to echo through the valley, though no sound followed it. When I reached the top, I turned back for one last look. The hills curved around the basin like gentle arms holding the world together. A single line of sunlight had begun to spill across them, soft and golden, chasing away the night's memory. For a moment, I thought I saw movement again, not the drifting of shadows this time, but something smaller, quieter. Tiny sparks of light flickered among the grass, disappearing as quickly as they came. It could have been the dew catching the sunrise, or maybe the valley wasn't done dreaming yet. I smiled at the thought and didn't bother deciding which was true. As I started down the far side of the hill, the hum I'd heard before returned, so faint it might have only been my heartbeat. But I like to think it was the valley's way of saying goodbye, or maybe thank you. Either way, I carried it with me, tucked somewhere quiet inside, where soft things stay. And as I walked into the new light, the shadow beside me stretched forward again, calm, rested, and ready for whatever the day would bring. So here's where the story ends. The valley has gone quiet again, resting beneath the morning sky. Its shadows have returned to their places, soft and still, while the air hums faintly with what remains of the night. You've traveled far enough for now. As you drift deeper into rest, imagine the gentle rise and fall of the hills, the slow rhythm of the earth breathing beneath you, and the faint shimmer of light sliding over the grass as dawn begins to bloom. There's nothing left to do, nowhere to be, only the quiet, waiting to hold you. Let the sounds around you fade into the background. Feel your body grow heavy and warm, as though the ground itself is keeping you safe. The day will come when it's ready. For now, stay here, in the still moment between dark and light. The valley rests, and so can you.